4,000 years of Old Testament history, and righteousness was never about the animal. It was about the heart.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are diving into a really incredible explainer covering a comprehensive biblical study titled How Can a Person Be Righteous in the Old Testament? Now, we are going on a bit of a journey through some of the absolute oldest texts in human history. And our main goal today? We're going to uncover this unified, unbroken thread. Really, it's a scarlet thread of righteousness by faith that weaves its way completely through the Old Testament. We're talking about tracing this from Adam all the way to the close of the Old Testament dispensation. It's like a giant puzzle, and we're going to piece together exactly how God's standard of righteousness has operated across thousands of years. It's going to be a lot of fun, so let's get right into it.
Okay, so here is a question that might actually keep you up at night if you really sit down and think about it. Way before Moses ever climbed up Mount Sinai, long before the Ten Commandments were literally carved into stone, and before there was any tabernacle or Levitical priesthood, how in the world did a person stand righteous before Almighty God? I mean, this isn't just some abstract academic riddle, it's actually the central mystery that makes the entire Old Testament make sense. Think about these legendary figures, men like Noah, Enoch, Abraham. None of them had a written law. So by what standard were they judged? Well, let's find out.
The answer to this ancient mystery is actually anchored in one thunderous verse. It's the same verse the Apostle Paul used to build his entire theological argument in the book of Romans. He wrote, "Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness." Think about that for a second. The core mechanism of righteousness has literally always been faith, just pure trust in God's person, His promise, and His provision. Now sure, the outward expression of that faith might look a little different depending on the era or the dispensation, if you want to use the theological term, but that inner driving principle, it remained absolutely consistent from day one.
To really wrap our heads around this, we actually need to define our terms, specifically looking at the ancient Hebrew. The text uses this fascinating word, tzedakah. This is the primary word that gets translated as righteousness in the Old Testament. It essentially means rightness, justice, and conformity to a divine standard. But, and this is absolutely crucial, so don't miss this, it is fundamentally a relational term. It describes the quality of a person standing before a holy God. Righteousness is not some human achievement you can just manufacture by trying really hard. It's definitely not a cultural construct. It's a quality of character that perfectly aligns with God's nature. And as we're about to see, because we can't create it ourselves, it's something God Himself has to supply.
So, if you do a careful study of the Old Testament, you'll see righteousness essentially operating in two concurrent streams. You have relational righteousness and you have behavioral righteousness. Relational righteousness is exactly what it sounds like. That right standing before God based entirely on inward faith and trust. It's a gift. But then, on the flip side, you have behavioral righteousness. That's the outward standard of conduct, the observable, communal obedience that God demanded from Israel as a functioning nation. These two streams flow together, but they originate from completely different sources. You literally cannot afford to confuse them. And, ironically enough, the story of human history pretty much kicks off with mankind confusing them almost immediately.
Let's actually go right back to the scene of the crime, the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve sinned and suddenly realized they were exposed, what was their very first instinct? They sewed fig leaves together. I mean, this is such a brilliant, tragic illustration of the very first human attempt to manufacture righteousness. They basically tried to use the vegetation of a cursed, fallen earth to cover up their shame. And later on, Cain did the exact same thing. He brought a bloodless offering of vegetables from that same cursed ground. But look at the stark contrast with divine provision. God entirely rejected the fig leaves. Instead, He made them coats of skins. Now, for God to do that, animals had to die. Innocent blood had to be shed to cover the guilty. Abel actually understood this. He brought the firstlings of his flock and it was accepted. Why? Because he offered it by faith, trusting entirely in God's divine provision rather than his own human effort.
And that right there brings us to this incredibly severe baseline rule that just echoes through the entire Bible. Hebrews 9:22 lays it out as plainly as possible, and without shedding of blood is no remission. God established this in the Garden of Eden at the very dawn of human sin. The price of sin is and always has been life. Our own human manufactured righteousness is always going to be completely insufficient to stand before a perfectly holy God. The covering absolutely has to come through a death that is initiated and provided by God Himself. Every single altar built and every single drop of blood offered throughout the whole Old Testament is essentially a reverberating echo of that very first sacrifice back in Eden.
Fast forward a bit and let's look at how this builds with the story of Noah. Think about this. When Noah finally stepped off the ark into this completely devastated, washed clean world, what was the very first thing he did? He built an altar and offered clean animals as burnt offerings. Now, nobody had handed him a written law telling him to do this. He had simply preserved this sacrificial tradition orally, passed all the way down from Adam. And how did God respond to this? The text tells us the Lord smelled a sweet savor and immediately declared he would never curse the ground again in that way. Noah approached God through a blood sacrifice, offered entirely in faith, and God's response was this sweeping, beautiful covenant grace.
Now we arrive at what is genuinely one of the most explosive, heavy-hitting verses in all of Scripture. Picture the scene. God brings Abraham outside under the night sky, tells him to look up, and promises that his descendants will somehow outnumber the stars. It's a promise that completely, 100% defies all natural possibility. And then Genesis 15:6 simply tells us, "And he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness." Notice what isn't there. Abraham didn't perform some elaborate ceremony. He didn't climb a sacred mountain or recite a specific creed. He literally just believed an impossible promise from an omnipotent God.
But to truly grasp what happened to Abraham under those stars, we have to dig into the Hebrew word that gets translated as counted. That word is cheshab. And here is the coolest part. It's actually a commercial accounting term. It means to reckon, to impute, or to credit to a ledger. So think of it like this. God took Abraham's inward, genuine faith and made this massive, impossible deposit of righteousness straight into Abraham's completely bankrupt moral ledger. He transferred it by divine action. Abraham didn't earn a single drop of it. It was credited to his account as if he possessed a perfect moral record. Talk about a game changer. Now, if you actually lay out the timeline of Abraham's life, it completely busts the popular myth that religious works or rituals are what save a person. Look at this sequence. First, Abraham is counted righteous by faith in Genesis 15. Then, a massive gap of at least 14 years passes. It's not until Genesis 17 that God finally commands circumcision as a sign of the covenant. The Apostle Paul points this out later with just unanswerable legal precision. Circumcision came way after Abraham was already declared righteous. The ritual was just a seal, right? It was a confirming outward stamp of an inward reality that had already existed for over a decade. Rituals are there to confirm what God has already done. They don't actually produce what only God can do. Which naturally brings us to a really significant number, 400. That's 400 years. This represents the long, bitter centuries of bondage the Israelites endured down in Egypt. And during this massive chunk of time, they essentially lived in complete silence when it came to public sacrifice. Why? Well, think about it. The very animals that Israel's God required for sacrifice, cows, rams, lambs, these were literally worshipped as sacred gods by the Egyptians. If the Israelites had started sacrificing them publicly, it would have incited absolute riots and mass death. So how on earth did they stay righteous during those 4 centuries? They survived entirely on oral tradition passed down around the dinner table and on a quiet, inward faith. Even in this incredibly dark, oppressive environment where public religion was flat out impossible, God miraculously preserved their covenant identity.
And the culmination of that 400-year captivity, it gives us one of the most brilliant, striking illustrations of faith in the entire Bible, the Passover. In Exodus 12, God tells them, "And when I see the blood, I will pass over you." Pay really close attention to what God did not say here. He didn't say, "when I see your good deeds," or "when I see your flawless moral record," or even "when I see how religiously sincere your family is." No, deliverance from judgment relied solely and exclusively on the blood of an innocent lamb applied by faith to a wooden doorpost. The standard that was established all the way back in Eden hadn't shifted a single inch.
So, right after this incredible exodus, the Israelites arrive at Mount Sinai, and we get the giving of the Mosaic Law. But what was it actually? Did it change the rules of the game? Not at all. As Paul explains in Galatians, the law was added because of transgressions. It was essentially layered on top of this pre-existing covenant of faith to make human sin abundantly, painfully visible. It absolutely did not introduce a brand new method of earning salvation. Instead, it took the patriarchal oral tradition, the exact same types of sacrifices Noah and Abraham were already doing, and just formalized it. It turned it into a permanent, national, written calendar with a dedicated professional priesthood. The core substance was exactly the same. It was only the institutional form that was new.
But, okay, here is the plot twist in our historical timeline. Centuries later, the prophet Ezekiel steps onto the scene and delivers some incredibly sobering warnings. Why? Because that Sinai covenant was conditional. God established what's called a bilateral or two-sided covenant with the nation of Israel. He explicitly said, "If you will obey my voice, then you shall be a peculiar treasure." Now yes, God graciously provided an entire sacrificial system for their daily stumbling and repenting, but a permanent, deliberate, willful apostasy, meaning completely abandoning the covenant and walking away, meant that a person's standing could actually be forfeited.
Ezekiel zeroes in on a really specific, incredibly dangerous counterfeit to true faith in chapter 33. He warns, if he trusts to his own righteousness, all his righteousnesses shall not be remembered. This is talking about the arrogant presumption that your past religious performance or your moral achievements have somehow built up enough capital in God's ledger to let you just live however you want in the present. God basically calls that kind of self-generated righteousness filthy rags. True Old Testament righteousness always required a living, active, genuine heart relationship with God. It was never ever just about going through the outward religious motions.
And you know who understood this inward requirement better than almost anyone? King David. Look at Psalm 51. After his absolute catastrophic sins of adultery and murder, he didn't immediately rush down to the tabernacle with a prized animal in his hand. No, he fell on his face and cried out, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." He wrote, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit." I mean, David was the king. He had the entire Levitical system at his disposal. He could have offered 1,000 bulls. But he knew that offering a mountain of animals with a proud, unrepentant heart was completely useless. The outward ritual only mattered if it was an authentic expression of genuine inward brokenness and faith.
So you might be wondering, what was the ultimate point of all these intense rules and millions of sacrifices? Well, Paul gives us this amazing analogy in Galatians, using the Greek word pedagogos, which translates to schoolmaster. In the ancient world, this wasn't just a teacher. This was a specific, trusted slave, whose entire job was to take the master's young son by the hand and walk him safely through the dangerous streets to deliver him to the actual teacher. The entire Mosaic Law was Israel's schoolmaster. It took them by the hand, led them through centuries of animal sacrifice, broken commandments, and prophetic judgments, just to walk them safely to the feet of the ultimate teacher, Jesus Christ.
So let's kind of pull all this together and retrace this scarlet thread of blood-based, faith-grounded righteousness. Think about where we started. It started with God providing animal skins in Eden to cover human shame. It was then preserved on Noah's altar right after the flood. It was credited to Abraham's ledger under the starry night sky. It was painted on the literal doorposts as the blood of the Passover lamb down in Egypt. And finally, it was formalized in the meticulous daily Levitical sacrifices. All of these historical signposts across thousands of years were pointing beautifully and deliberately toward one single ultimate destination. Every single sacrificed animal was just a promissory note. It was a prophecy of the cross.
Which lands us squarely on this definitive verdict from the Apostle Paul in Romans, "For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believeth." Now that word "end" in the original Greek is telos, and it's so important to note that it doesn't mean abolition or termination, like it's just over. It means the target, the bullseye, the final destination. Jesus Christ is exactly what the law was always aiming at from day one. The cross was God's timeless, eternal solution. Its power reached backward in time to cover every single Old Testament saint who offered their sacrifices in genuine faith, and it reaches forward to cover every believer today.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. If there has literally always been one God, one way, one requirement of blood, and one standard of faith across all of human history, what are you trusting to cover your ledger today? Are you out there sewing together your own fig leaves of human effort and good deeds? Or are you resting completely in God's divine provision? It's the most important question you'll ever answer. I really hope this explainer has illuminated these ancient texts for you and brought the big picture into focus. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you in the next one.